Recently, one of our buddies landed a part-time job on LinkedIn thanks to our videos. But whether the job is remote or in person, they all have interviews. Without exception, the interviewers are going to ask them questions. Hey, do you know about Uniswap or DEXs? Can we chat about it? I'm curious about how the liquidity model is calculated. So, for those who are just getting into smart contract development, these questions might not make much sense. In the next part of the video, I'll give you a detailed overview. Let's talk about the benchmark in this DEX space, Uniswap. It has some key features and a lot of code to unpack, so I'll break it down into several video sections. To avoid getting lost, I recommend everyone hit the subscribe button first before continuing to watch our video. As for why we're only talking about Uniswap, because all the DEXs, basically, everything follows the Uniswap standard. Here we can check out the Uniswap documentation, which includes V1, V2, V3, V4, right? So, I believe everybody about the V4. Here's a part where it says that it's currently in development and the contracts are changing. So if we're talking about an upgrade, this document will get updated too, which basically means it isn't really up and running yet. We haven't spotted it in the code, but V2 and V3 are both good to go. When we add liquidity, we can only choose between V2 or V3. But the draft for V4 has already been made public. If you're interested, stick around, usually in an interview. They'll just chat with you about the concepts of V2 and V3. As long as you get those two, you'll pretty much be good to go. So, looking at the timeline for Uniswap, V1 launched in November 2018. Isn't it introduced this really innovative mechanism, which is XYK. So based on this product model, we set the pricing for the trade, which basically establishes the mechanism for this AMM. That's what we have in V1. Let me add a bit more explanation here. As we mentioned earlier, X and Y represent the amounts of token A and token B on the chart, respectively. Once the pool is deployed, the K value remains constant. Suppose I want to buy token A. I need to use token B to make the purchase. At this point, I would need to add token B to the pool. However, since the K value doesn't change, I must release a certain amount of token A. The amount released depends on the K value. As for V2, so it's basically just V1, where this XY equals K model has added something called an oracle, which is like a prediction tool, so we can link V1 and V2 together. Think of it as just one thing, because there hasn't been much of an upgrade. It's pretty much all about XY equals K, so the whole liquidity is pretty much everywhere, starting from 0 to the highest price. It means all positions and all price ranges are completely filled. So V3 came out in May 2021. It had three major innovations. One is concentrated liquidity, another is the feed tiers. The last one is NFTs. As proof of this liquidity, you can also see where you open your position. Light, in what range you opened it. For V4, that's back in June 2023. I'll just save it for later. It's been over a year already. He added a feature for making hooks, but he hasn't actually used it in the app yet. Alright, so next up, I'll focus mainly on the fifth point and talk about the key elements in V3 and its advantages. I've listed a total of 8 items here. So in our diagram, there are 3 main elements, but I've listed 8 key factors here. When I mention concentrated liquidity, I'm specifically talking about what's in Uniswap V2. A liquidity provider has to operate within the entire price range. By entire price range, I mean from 0 all the way up to infinity. Any price has its own liquidity, so if you distribute it this way, most of your funds aren't really being used effectively. You spread that liquidity out to infinity, but we know that for a lot of these assets, their price fluctuations aren't that big. Take either ARM or BTC. For example, those usually wobble around just 10 to 20. There's a pretty good chance of some fluctuation. And you've got things like stable coins, almost 1 to 1. So, we're planning to focus all the assets we're adding on. Let me give you an example. If you're like a stablecoin, I would focus on providing liquidity within the range of 0.99 to 1. If it goes beyond that grid strategy, then I wouldn't provide liquidity. So with Uniswap, you can add liquidity within a specific price range. Now, let's move on to the second point. It's basically a range for custom pricing. So in Uniswap V3, there's in-person liquidity providers can set a specific price range for their liquidity. You can definitely tweak it like that, right? So, for a range of fluctuations, take the Ether here on the chart. I only want to provide liquidity between 3,000 and 4,000, or I can set it below the current price. For example, between 1,000 and 2,000 to do the liquidity, right? So, I could do both sides. right? Like, you can set a price. It kind of feels like this grid strategy. I'm not sure if everyone knows about that. Prison grid trading strategy is all about distributing liquidity. You buy more when the price drops and sell more when it goes up. It's as simple as that. But if I make this grid really small and only do a little range optimization, I wouldn't do anything if the grid goes above that price or drops below my set price. So, basically, this can help our LPS understand the concept better and reduce the risk of losses. Like, if I drop below a certain price, I won't just keep buying and buying. But if I were Uniswap V2, I'd say that if it drops below a certain price, or honestly, if there's really no set price at all, you just gotta buy whenever it drops. So, that custom price range thing. So, actually reduces the risk of that impermanent loss a bit. Thus, Uniswap V3 introduced a few options, like 0, 5, 0, 3, even 1, for liquidity providers. They can't weight their options based on market conditions and their own risk preferences. This is especially important for trading pairs that are pretty volatile. It usually goes for higher rates to offset the increased risk of impermanent loss. But when it comes to stablecoins, the trading fees are super low to attract more trading volume and achieve higher profits. This kind of flexibility allows LPS to optimize based on different markets and assets. Their LP strategy. The fourth point is about managing non-compensable losses. Like I mentioned earlier, all about being deliberate, which can help reduce that funding in a passive price range. Doesn't just happen automatically, you have to adjust it yourself. You decide where you think the price should sit, which makes the most sense. So, we call this a sort of manual semi-automatic approach to reduce the risk of this kind of loss. LME still needs to keep an eye on the market because if prices really do suddenly crash, it could be a problem. So the users here need to make some adjustments too, which has been mentioned. What I've got is kind of a semi-automated thing, just like I talked about a few days ago, right? Well, the market just took a sudden dive. Do you think you should pull out your liquidity and readjust things? That's kind of the move here, right? It's really similar to that grid strategy. Like a semi-automatic grid strategy, when we talk about NFT, it represents a position in that liquidity. But what do we mean by position? Let's put it another way. It should be called a position. So we know that in Uniswap V2, an LP's position was represented using ERC20 tokens. It's like the number of LP tokens I have shows how much of the pool I own. It's all distributed based on that. For example, if I have 100 LP tokens, I've got 10 LP tokens, so I own 10 of that pool. You can think of it like that. But with Uniswap V3, since each LP, there's a custom price range, so each position is really unique. I can open 3 positions within that range and add liquidity 3 times. Can I just add it all at once in one place? I added another time here. The last time I added something here too. Those 3 times were different, with different prices and amounts I added. So, the developers of Uniswap, forget about the old LP tokens. We're switching to using this new setup with NFTs, or our ERC20 tokens to represent each position we have. Since we know that an FT can store information, I can use it to keep track of the price ranges for my liquidity positions and how much capital I've provided. Stuff like that. This means that every liquidity provider gets this tailored liquidity, which also includes an automatic routing mechanism for trades in Uniswap V3. They introduced something called Universal Router, which is a universal router designed to make management easier, especially with the current V2 and V3. Even looking ahead to V4, they did a big integration of a universal router this month, wrapping V2 and V3 in it, even prepping for future V4. This makes it easier to upgrade down the line. It's all managed through this router. We can make cross-protocol calls. When we execute a transaction, we're actually calling this universal routing contract. We'll get into the code details later. But as we mentioned earlier, if we switch from V2 to V3, how much is the capital efficiency boosted? I found online that it's about 4,000 times better. That means with the V3 systems LP, you can achieve the same returns as V2 but with less money. You think about it differently. It's like saying, if you're using a grid, you're doing a grid strategy. I know for a fact that it's just bouncing around in this range. There's no way it's gonna swing more than 20 in a day. So I'll just focus all my funds on that 20 range for buying low and selling high. That way, don't you end up making more in profits or fees? Oh, I see what you mean. So the eighth one is about active management strategies, which basically gives liquidity providers some flexibility, just like I mentioned earlier. This semi-automatic thing means that if there's a big change in the market, we can pull back a bit and still operate in this semi-automatic way to maximize this profit. We'll save the coding part for the next video where I'll explain everything. The main code is divided into a few major sections. The first one is the Uniswap V3 factory. The V3 factory and the V3 pool. Here are the core contracts for each liquidity pool, managing the liquidity and the fees. Also, there's the trading logic. Then you've got tick and tick bitmap, which are used to manage price ranges and liquidity distribution. On top of that, there's an oracle. We're basically talking about an oracle that provides time-weighted average prices. In our next video, we're going to focus on some key parts of this. It also includes setting up and initializing the liquidity pool, which is a flowchart for the create pool process. Plus, we'll go over some formulas for calculating ratios together. If you want to learn about developing on the Solana chain and their EVM chain, make sure to follow our channel for more related content. If you'd like to join our community, you can visit our website, where you'll find a link to join our Discord server. See you there.